The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We now have a full year of data from Tennessee's drug testing of welfare recipients, and it turns out that it uncovered drug use by less than 0.2% of all applicants for the state's public assistance program. The state started this drug testing regime in 2014. They added 3 questions about narcotics use to the application form. And anyone who answers yes to any of the 3 questions has to take a urine test or have their application thrown away immediately. If you fail the urine test, you have to complete a drug treatment program and pass a second test or lose 6 months of benefits. Here are the numbers. 28,000 or so people applied for temporary assistance for needy families. 1.6% answered yes to one of the 3 questions. And of the 1.6% that answered yes to one of the 3 questions, 11% flunked the test. That's a total, Lewis, of 55 people testing positive for drugs out of an applicant pool of 30,000. So let's run the numbers here on how much this saved and how much it cost. The drug testing, we are told on paper, the drug test cost is $11,000. Okay. But that only is what the state paid to the outside vendor that did the actual tests. So we have to include Tennessee employee staff hours. We need to consider the logistics for planning, implementing, and managing this program and all of that other stuff. If you look at the average benefit from TAMF, temporary assistance for needy families, it's about $160 per month. And as I mentioned, Lewis, when you fail the test, you lose benefits for a period of 6 months and then you can reapply. So that is about $30,000 based on a 6-month period of loss of benefits, and $60,000 if they fail a subsequent test. I don't know, right? I mean, if you look at just the numbers here, it looks like it's pretty close to break even. You've got the $11,000 for the tests themselves, but then you have all these hundreds and thousands of hours for different employees, and all you've really created is a savings of about $30,000 to $60,000, aside from the fact that the Supreme Court has already decided drug testing everybody is unconstitutional. You have to put in these questions, and only if people answer yes can you drug test them. It seems that there's so many problems with this. Number one, there's not a clear financial benefit. Number two, if you only test people who admit to having used drugs, you're also not actually going to catch everybody who's using drugs, because some people were probably wise enough not to admit it. None of this makes any sense to me.
Yeah, it seems like it is just, some people might say that it's the right thing to do, and that I can understand the point of view of some people saying, listen, I don't want heroin addicts and crack addicts getting these government funds. But should someone who smokes pot, be denied this? I guess
the answer is pot legal in that state, right? I don't know. How do you answer that? Obviously, my opinion is that the answer should be no. It's ridiculous.
Regardless from the legal point of view, or from a moral one, I would say no. I would say you should be able to smoke pot and still get welfare benefits if you need them, of course. So I think this whole thing is pretty absurd. And if Tennessee eventually does have, medical, what happens with medical marijuana if that becomes legal, recreational, they'll have to change their whole system here. It's just not necessary.
If they want to test the needy, then anyone receiving state money should also be tested. That includes politicians, that includes police officers, that includes any companies receiving state subsidies. Let's test the CEO. Why is this only being done to the poorest in society?
Well, because of, I don't know, stereotypes, right? Because poor people do drugs, Dave. And if they're doing drugs, they're going to spend their government money on drugs, even though that's not how it works. But, that's what people think.
Uber's CEO made headlines when he said he would buy every single autonomous vehicle that Tesla can produce. Next year, 50 people in Japan are going to start using driverless taxis to get between their homes and the local grocery store. They're going to try this in Kanagawa Prefecture. Is it pronounced prefecture or prefecture?
I would say prefecture.
Interesting. All right. Well, it's going to take place in Kanagawa, south of Tokyo. There's a company called Robot Taxi. It's a joint venture between the firm DNA, as in DENA, and a vehicle technology developer called ZMP. They're going to roll out self-driving taxis and self-driving buses. The technology in the taxis will include GPS, millimeter wave radar, stereo vision cameras, as well as image analysis to get around. During this trial period, the taxis are going to drive a distance of about 3 kilometers, or just under 2 miles, partially on major avenues, and there will be crew members on board to begin with in case they are needed to avoid accidents. A few people emailed me asking, why does it seem like Japan is always so far ahead of the US technologically? I don't know that that's actually true, Lewis. I think that in the US, a lot of the technological advancement goes straight to military technology, whereas in Japan, more of that advancement is going towards publicly available technology. I don't actually think that this represents anything more advanced than what we have here in the US. It's just that they're directly and quickly applying it to public benefit.
Yeah, it really depends on the industries and sectors you're looking at. I mean, look at companies like, Intel, and look what's happening in California. I mean, so much of the world's microprocessors are coming out of the United States. And I don't know, in Japan, I think it's more, it's got a different feel, and they have different applications.
I still get emails, Lewis, from people who say autonomous vehicles are a fantasy. Self-driving cars are not happening. Look at what we have now. Audi and Google have vehicles that have been tested, including on public roads, that have driven millions of miles. We have a driverless truck corridor being developed in the United States. In Canadian mining operations, employees are already starting to be replaced early in the process with autonomous mining trucks. In the Netherlands, I told you about a self-driving bus that is going to be remotely monitored by staff for safety. In GM's facility, I told you yesterday, they are going to be using self-driving Chevy Volts for employees to get around the campus, and they will be able to call them via a remote application. They are also putting out this Super Cruise heavily autonomous vehicle next year. It's not going to be a fully autonomous vehicle, but heavily autonomous. And Japan is moving forward with tests of driverless taxis. How could anyone who has any connection to the real world, Lewis, still insist that either A, this isn't happening, or B, that it's 50 years away?
Well, it may be, I don't know how long it's going to be until all cars are autonomous.
Of course.
But it's definitely going to happen, because autonomous vehicles means that big companies with lots of money can afford to lay off employees and have robots working for them instead of people, which means more profit.
And so we've talked about that, right? We've talked about the reality that autonomous vehicles will lead to job loss.
Yes.
And that's something that society will have to deal with. But it's not going to prevent autonomous vehicles. And Lewis is making a good point, which is, while we may not like it, when there is such a profit motive from something like this, it's going to happen. Companies are going to do it. That's not the reason why I believe it is inevitable, but it's certainly a big factor.
Huge factor. Dave, profit drives everything in this world. Everything.
Let's talk a little bit about my new hobby. I mentioned, I think it was last week during audience questions, somebody asked if I would take up new hobbies. And I said, I'm actually interested in finding some new hobby. I don't know exactly what it will be. And I got a ton of suggestions, Lewis. Let's go through some of these. Matt said I should take up karate, or karate, as I believe some people like to pronounce it. They apparently, those people don't know that I was a white belt with a green tip, I believe it was, when I was about 7 years old. I went on a trip to visit my family in Argentina and never went back. Heather wrote to me suggesting that I get into the hobby of carving tiny furniture for doll houses like Lester Freeman in The Wire. James wrote to me saying I should take up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Mike suggested woodworking. Knitting was suggested. Bird watching. There is no chance that my new hobby is going to be bird watching. Powerlifting was suggested. Doing Rubik's Cubes. That I don't think is going to happen. Carpentry, which is pretty general, but it seems interesting. Surfing. Not going to work for me living in Boston, although I do know people in Boston that surf year-round in the freezing cold water. Video games is a new hobby. I do enough sitting in front of screens. The whole point of a new hobby for me is not to do that. And archery was suggested. And of course, Lewis, you always are going to have something like this when we have any suggestion relating to our personal lives. Tandem gay bike riding was suggested as a new hobby for me. Do any of these tickle your fancy?
Well, for me, I think as someone who has taken a little bit of karate, I would do that if it were easy and I thought I had time. Same applies to jiu-jitsu. I think it could be fun, and it's a good hobby because it's physical and it gets you, you're not sitting down, you're active, it's healthy. Those are healthy hobbies. But for me, I think I would want to do something a bit more artistic. And so, as people know, I have been doing some painting. Maybe I'll get into that. Maybe I'll buy some supplies and do a bit more of that.
Interesting. Yeah. Now, what about, is bird watching something that strikes you as interesting?
Not at all. I appreciate birds, but standing around with binoculars is not my idea of a hobby.
I feel like we're being too dismissive of it. Like, I know that people really do like it. You do. I mean, generally, you're outside when you're bird watching. You're in different wilderness areas and what have you. So we know that there's a health benefit to spending time in the great outdoors and what have you. You may be hiking to where it is that you watch the birds. I think it may be more athletic than maybe we're giving it credit for.
That's true, but I would rather hike up to somewhere that has a nice view and look for scenic spots and things like that. But the stopping and the waiting and the looking for birds with binoculars and things like that, I don't think I would enjoy that.
All right. Which of these hobbies should Lewis take up? Which of these hobbies should I take up? You can reach us on Twitter. The show is at David Pakman Show. I am at D Pakman, and Lewis is at Lewis Motamedi, LouisMotamedi. We've got a great program for you today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
If you ever shop on Amazon.com, the shopping you do can support the work we are doing. If you go to davidpakman.com/Amazon, that will redirect you to Amazon with our affiliate link. And what that does is makes it so that anytime you buy something on Amazon, we get a little kickback, somewhere between 7 and 8% of what you buy. davidpakman.com/Amazon. You can also become a David Pakman Show member and get the world famous bonus show at davidpakman.com/membership. Today's new member of the day is James Garnhart. James, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. Not only do you get all the great perks, you're also supporting the work we do, which is huge, to say the least. 3 years ago this week, Penn State child molester Jerry Sandusky was sentenced to up to 60 years in prison for sexually abusing 10 young boys over a 15-year span. Of course, Jerry Sandusky worked with longtime Penn State football coach Joe Paterno. Had Joe Paterno not passed away shortly after the revelations, it's very possible that he could have also faced charges for covering up the abuse that took place. In July of 2014, Jerry Sandusky's adopted son told the world that the sexual abuse he suffered at the hands of Jerry Sandusky was much worse than he had originally stated. Sort of didn't make too much news because at the time Jerry Sandusky was already in prison for up to 60 years. It sort of seemed as though Penn State, and especially the football program, were putting the school's reputation over the well-being of the children. And we know how huge of a business college football is for schools with big football programs. Last week, Penn State rescinded an invitation to a war veteran with ties to Jerry Sandusky after some outrage. Bruce Heim was a board member of the organization that Sandusky founded, through which he found his victims originally. And Heim once said that he saw Sandusky showering with a boy, but he didn't think that it was sexual. In case you haven't been following this, and to be honest, I don't blame you if you haven't, Jerry Sandusky is still trying to fight his conviction. I will keep you posted as to whether there's any news on that front, but I don't anticipate very good news for Jerry Sandusky there. 2 years ago this week, Jan Brewer could not pronounce Tuskegee at an event honoring the Tuskegee Airmen. This is, of course, Jan Brewer, the infamous Arizona Republican governor who presided over the Show Me Your Papers SB 1070 law there. I think that this was more a reflection of how little Jan Brewer cared about the event rather than any sort of English language problems that she has. Let me remind you what that sounded like if you forgot.
And I thank you, everyone, for joining us today as we honor an important and historic military unit whose contribution went way beyond the battlefield. The Tuskegee. Say it again. Tuskegee. I've been practicing this all morning, I did good last year. Tuskegee. Okay.
Politicians are under a lot of pressure to remember many names. It's not always easy, but that still doesn't make these bloopers any less enjoyable. And I want to remind you of a few from recent history that I like. We had John McCain mispronouncing the name of Georgian President Saakashvili as Shashkavili. I mean, I think that's how he pronounced it, 3 times in one sitting. President Obama once pronounced Corpsman as Corpsman, which sent chills down the spines of right-wingers everywhere. Not that President Obama has to work too hard to outrage right-wingers everywhere. Obama also managed to mispronounce Orion. Sarah Palin followed George W. Bush in pronouncing nuclear as nuclear, which is still one of my general favorites. Senator Mike Enzi was completely unable to pronounce Blagojevich, Rod Blagojevich's last name. Then he laughed about it. And finally, Hillary Clinton was trying to say Medvedev and ended up saying whatever. So I don't think this is really a big criticism of politicians in the sense that sometimes last names are difficult to pronounce. Sometimes certain words are difficult to pronounce. Nuclear, though, is not an example of that. That, to me, is still one of the most ridiculous ones that seems to happen time and again. Nuclear weapons. If you want to seem trustworthy and reliable on the topic of nuclear proliferation, don't say nuclear. I think it's pretty easy to have somebody mention that one to you if you have handlers, if you're a politician of any significant stature. 1 year ago this week, 4 people were prosecuted under the AgGag law for photographing Circle 4 farms from a public road. These AgGag laws are truly despicable. They prevent people or whistleblowers from filming farms. In most cases, we're talking about these massive animal farms where disgusting and despicable things are happening all the time. In this case, those who were filming were not even on the property, let alone in the building. They were photographing from a public road. And these laws are a real testament to the sort of power that the food and farm lobby can have. We do need to consider, I guess, what would happen if the laws were not in place. If these slaughterhouses and factory farms were revealed for what they are, it could cause drastic, irreparable damage to the agriculture industry. Much of our meat comes from only a handful of these huge factory farms. So those who are advocates of vegetarianism or veganism are very much in favor of that. They would say, hey, that would be fantastic if a huge scandal erupted and interrupted the flow of dead animals. That would be great. There are others who say, listen, you want to be a vegetarian or vegan, that's fine. That's not the reality for most people right now. And we are not really set up to continue feeding everybody if we eliminate our supplies of meat. So we do need to take that into consideration with these AgGag laws. My view is the AgGag laws are the epitome and microcosm of corporate power. We need free speech. We need to allow people to do journalism. If you're standing on a public road, you should be allowed to film. And I am disgusted by these laws. I've said many times, I am not a vegetarian, although I have gone much more in the direction of eating poultry and fish and cutting out most other types of meat and also reducing my consumption of most types of meat. I believe people can make decisions for themselves, but there is no reason to kowtow to these lobbying groups and these factory farms. The AgGag laws are despicable, and I want to see them rescinded as soon as possible. Obviously, I don't have nearly as much power as the lobbies that got those laws passed in the first place. And the photographs that we got of Circle 4 farms should absolutely be legal, and there should be much more of that going on. The idea, though, is to make people so afraid, and making examples out of people who break these laws is a great way to make other would-be investigative journalists afraid. Make people so afraid that they just don't do it, and the vile factory farming merely continues unaffected.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to The David Pakman Show.
For our classic interview today, we're going back to an interview that I really, really like. It is from February of 2013 with theoretical physicist Lawrence Krauss. He's also a cosmologist. We had a conversation about whether teaching kids creationism, which also often includes the fear of going to hell if you misbehave, is teaching creationism a form of child abuse. This was a very controversial interview when it first aired in February of 2013. And because of the audience growth, there are many people in our audience today who never saw this interview. This is one of my favorites. Lawrence Krauss, always one of my favorite guests on the show. We're hoping to have him on soon to talk about new stuff. But for today, we'll go back to 2013. Is teaching kids creationism a form of child abuse? Let's take a look. Joining me is Professor Lawrence Krauss, theoretical physicist, cosmologist, a professor of physics, and director of the Origins Project at Arizona State University. Professor, it's great to talk to you. I watched your video where you suggest that teaching creationism is a form of child abuse with great interest, because I suggested on this program a couple of weeks ago that threatening children with going to hell is a form of child abuse, and very specifically, I looked at a definition of child abuse which included the causing of irrational fear, and I said, what is more irrational of a fear than the fear of going to hell? Explain, with your particular case of creationism, how do you make the connection to child abuse?
Well, of course, there are various levels of child abuse, and saying they're going to hell is worse than teaching creationism, but the idea is that, in my mind, that withholding anything from your children that gives them a disadvantage or harms them and puts them at a disadvantage compared to others, especially as they grow into adulthood, is child abuse. Now, of course, as parents, we all do that at some level. But, for example, I think withholding education is a milder version of say, withholding medicine. It's putting your children at a disadvantage. It's not sexual abuse. It's not female genital mutilation. And it isn't giving them nightmares by telling them they're going to go to hell. But what it is doing is putting them at a competitive disadvantage, withholding knowledge, filling their minds full of fake stories and telling them that they should believe this in spite of reality, puts them at a disadvantage. It means that they are not. First of all, one of two things can happen. One, they will learn that in fact what they've been told is a lie, and what that'll do is cause them to distrust their parents and the other lessons that they learn, and maybe that's not so bad in general, but or they won't, and what they'll do is they'll go through life believing a myth and not understanding aspects that are crucial as we develop a society in the 21st century that will require an educated workforce in biotechnology, and evolution is the basis of modern technology, and to deal with the other challenges we need to deal with. If you live your life believing a lie, you're at a disadvantage. So sure, it's mild child abuse, but it is. We need to encourage our children to question freely and to try and think for themselves. And anything we do that counters that is unfair to them.
I want to get to motive in a second, but the response I got when I talked about my hell example, a lot of people saying, hold on a second, parents knowingly teach their kids, or not teach, but many parents talk to their kids about Santa Claus, and eventually the kids do find out that Santa Claus isn't real. And my distinction was that believing in Santa Claus doesn't correlate with anything particularly negative. Eventually, kids figure it out. There's no downside to believing in Santa Claus temporarily. Tie that in a little.
Well, exactly. But the difference is we all teach our kids, or many of us teach our kids about Santa Claus, but we do it with the express knowledge that at a certain age, we'll say, you know, that was just something we were telling you. And if that's really neat, we basically are preparing them to learn that the myths of their childhood are not all there, and we're doing it gently. And we also we're also doing it knowing in advance that we're going to teach them that their parents are creating a myth for them and that they maybe should be wondering about other things they're told. So no one, well, I don't think anyone ever introduces Santa Claus with the intent, desire to have their kids believe in Santa Claus for the rest of their life. And if they did, they'd be abusing their kids, because the kids would wake up as adults waiting for their presents on Christmas morning and be devastated. So it's a very different thing. We're teaching it as a story. It's like we're teaching it as a fable, as to try, and we're doing it with the express knowledge that we will introduce them to the real world. Now, if you introduce the Bible stories, for example, if you ever found one that actually involved morality instead of the opposite, and then you or Jonah and the whale or whatever you want, and you say, you know what, these are really stories, but what we're trying to tell you is that you can be patient and whatever, then that's a different thing. But if you're introducing it as reality, if you're telling kids the Earth is 6,000 years old and they shouldn't believe scientists because there's no way that humans are related to other animals, and don't believe any of that stuff you learn in school, then, or take your kids out of school because they're actually learning something, well, then it's like the Taliban at some level, which is an extreme form of child abuse. The Taliban don't want girls to be educated or people to be educated, because when they do, they'll understand the myths that they're learning are crap, and they'll do something else. So the greatest power you can have over children and adults is to remove information from them, because the more they know, the more likely they are to think for themselves. And so it's vastly different to tell kids a story that you know they're going to accept as a story than to try and tell them that the reality is false. This myth is true, and they shouldn't believe scientists, because it's a slippery slope. Because when you tell them you don't believe in evolution, well, then then all the rest of science and the results of science become suspect.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, is motive an issue at all? In other words, if the parent truly believes either that creationism is the truth, or like some of the people, for example, that Richard Dawkins has interviewed, I think the woman Wendy something from Women for Concern, that whole thing, where they say the jury is kind of out. There's two theories here. If they really in good faith believe that, is it still child abuse?
Yes, of course it is. The parent, it's child abuse. They're not knowingly trying to hurt their children, but you know what? The people who don't allow blood transfusions to their kids are not knowingly trying to hurt their kids, but they are hurting their kids, and the kids should be removed from the parents. The parents are not the appropriate guides of these children. They're hurting them. The people who don't allow their kids to get vaccinated are hurting their children. It may be out of ignorance. So child abuse, I mean, you know what? Oh, I'm sure a lot of people that commit child abuse think they're doing something good for the kid, but they're not. And just because they think they're doing something good for the kid doesn't mean they are. So I suspect, although I don't know, I suspect very few people, the people who do genital mutilation somehow think they're doing the girls a favor, but they're not. So we can't say, oh, just because you're well-intentioned, you're doing the right thing.
Who ultimately gets to determine whether something is good or bad, ultimately?
Well, obviously, what we need to do is educate people. So parents, for better or worse, do have power over their children. And many of us, I've been a parent, and I don't know if you've been, find ourselves having done things we wish we hadn't done. We could have done better. None of us are perfect in that regard. But what we need to do is, I think, ultimately, for example, we should be very careful about allowing parents to remove their children from schools. Because we tend to do it for impunity for religious reasons, but I think it's what we have to ask is, are we being unfair to the children? And so, it's a careful. Obviously, you don't want the state to tell you, and you don't want to be told what you can do and what you can't do at all levels of your life. But for certain basic things like medicine, healthcare, and education, I think society has an obligation to ensure that children have access to all of those.
All right, we've been speaking with Lawrence Krauss, theoretical physicist, director of the Origins Project at Arizona State University. Really a pleasure. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you. I hope it was helpful.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It is that time of the week. Let's answer some questions from the audience. First question today, delivered via voicemail, 219-2DAVID-P or 219-232-8437. It's about spanking as punishment for children. Let's take a listen.
I have a question about, you did a video on Adrian Peterson, and then I saw a lot of the comments on the video, so I want to know, what do you think about spanking? Do you think it's a valid punishment? Okay, that's it. I don't know.
Okay. I do not think spanking children makes sense. I do not think that it encourages good behavior in any real and long-term way. I think it has been shown to be counterproductive as well as traumatic for the children. I don't believe in hitting children. Period. I mean, my feelings on this are pretty clear, Lewis. I don't think it is a moral punishment. I don't think it ingrains any sort of values that make sense into the kids. And I think it can also cause serious damage. And we also happen to know, by the way, that right-wing parents are more likely to be the authoritarian types of parents that spank. And being spanked is also more likely to lead to you. It's more likely to correlate to you ultimately being conservative, although it may not actually be the spanking that causes it. It may be just a result of how more conservative parents are more likely to spank.
Yeah, so I am against it, although I am not going to say that this is going to cause some... I mean, there's different levels of severity here too, right? I mean, are you hitting your kid with a belt and causing welts? And how brutal is it? That I think can be very damaging, but I'm not going to say that light spanking or, physical punishment of that sort, I'm not going to say it's all mentally damaging to children because...
So let's explore that though. You have a kid, accident, you love the kid, great. At what age do you begin instituting some kind of physical punishment to the kid? What's the minimum age at which you think it would be okay?
I mean, I don't think it's okay, but I'm against it. But I'm just saying I don't think it's going to turn your kid into Ted Bundy. You know what I'm saying?
If you were to do something like this, though, is there a minimum age you would have in your head below which you would say, I wouldn't do it at any age, as you said, but here's the age at which I think other people should wait for until they do it?
I have no idea. I can't answer. I have no idea how to answer that.
Interesting. And then my other thing is, how do you describe light spanking? And let me walk us through this. Part A of the question is, what parts of the body do you believe that light spanking would be okay?
I don't even know. Doesn't spanking always mean on the butt?
No, I mean, I think spanking in general could be physical hitting on different parts of the body.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are parents that spank their kids, but are doing it in such a way that it doesn't even hurt the kids. So, it's kind of more like you would pinch a dog or something like that, Huh.
So like pinching a kid's earlobe or something like that.
I had my earlobe pinched by a teacher once. It was, yeah, you know, I really don't know. Just there's so many different levels of severity when it comes to physical punishment.
Yeah. And I think as we're getting into here, age, where do you do it? How hard do you hit? What makes sense is not to do it. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't encourage good behavior. It doesn't help lead to someone developing into a well-adjusted individual. I am against spanking as punishment very, very clearly. If you disagree, if you think that spanking is a great thing, if you think good things come from spanking kids, write to me. I'm curious to hear what your explanation is. Isabella wrote in. Isabella says, have either of you been involved in pyramid schemes? Have others you know been involved in pyramid schemes? Lewis, you want to tackle this one first?
All right. I have not been involved, although shortly after moving to Austin, I was approached by someone who might have recognized me on the show, might have just thought I was a huge sucker, and tried to get me involved with Amway.
Right.
And I didn't know what Amway was at the time. And I look it up immediately after talking with this guy and immediately realize it's one of those pyramid schemes. And
Lewis, it's a network marketing opportunity. It's not a pyramid scheme.
Right. Multi-level marketing scheme. And so I called him out on it, and he wasn't happy to hear that. And he was like, oh, you know, what's not, I make a lot of money. I help people make a lot of money. And I'm thinking to myself, that's all it's about is money. I mean, you know, that money's coming from somewhere and people are getting screwed.
And usually it's a lie that they make a lot of money. If you actually, those programs are supposed to actually tell you what the average earnings are. And you hear from people, oh, you can make 6 figures if you recruit this number. You can make 7 figures if you recruit this number of people. And the reality is almost no one actually makes that amount. Somebody conceivably might be doing it. I've been recruited many times into multi-level marketing schemes, call it what you want. The counter from people who defend these schemes is usually, listen, there is usually a product being sold that is a good product. But yeah, part of your revenue does depend on recruiting other people to sort of work below you and earning a share of that revenue. And sadly, I've had many friends who get pulled into this, and it's been the Cutco knife one, Amway, as Lewis describes, many, many others. I don't even need to name them all. And they come to me and they want to get me involved, and they say how it's abundantly clear they're going to make a ton of money. And I say to them every single time, in a year, you will look back at this and you will be angry that you ever fell for it. And they swear up and down that that will never happen. And every single time it does. And I don't harp on it. I don't make fun of them. I actually feel really bad because if you look online, it's very easy to figure out when you're dealing with one of these schemes, and people invest real time into it. And it is really sad.
I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to say, I told you so, and to you know, poke some fun at them, because some people don't learn from their mistakes. And so I think in some cases you need to make sure that they don't forget and that they learn from their mistakes. But yes, I did not fall for it, and don't get involved in this nonsense.
And there's very clear rebuttals that you should watch out for, which might sound okay. So for example, somebody pitches you on this idea. You go, this sounds like one of those pyramid schemes. And there's this the response is always similar. It's a little different depending on which company, but they're trained to say, listen, there's a lot of misunderstandings about so-called pyramid schemes. What we do is we run a network marketing company where you are offering good products and services that are really good for people. And part of building your business is about presenting this business opportunity to others, blah, 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 right? It goes on from there. Another one is when you say, wait a second, why do I need to pay just to start working? That sounds like a scam. And people will come back and they'll say, listen, if you were to start your own business, you would have to pay. If you wanted to be a carpenter, you'd have to rent or buy equipment. If you wanted to be a radio show host, you'd have to buy microphones and airtime and whatever. So it's, in this case, you only pay for a little bit of the startup costs. Our organization provides you with all the tools, same type of thing. And you can start to spot that they all have the same answers to these questions.
Yeah. And after they tell you that, the appropriate response would be something like, F you, I think.
I don't react that way because I truly believe that the people don't understand what they're being suckered into.
Or you are dealing with someone who is at the top and, you know, kind of, you know, maybe a ringleader or someone who is, you know, recruiting people and is fully aware that this is a pyramid scheme. And in that case, yeah, okay, you can tell them to go F themselves. But in other cases, I guess you can try and talk sense into this person if they're your friend.
Last question today is from Alexis. Very different question than the other ones we've dealt with. Alexis says, we don't usually do would you rathers, but we're going to do one because this one's kind of odd. Would you rather have a head the size of a tennis ball or the size of a large watermelon? These are always weird, Lewis, because there's usually some simple caveat. Like, for example, for me, the answer to this one would be, it depends on the size of my body, right? Or does it just assume with my body size? Your body size. I'm already sort of known for having a large head. It was always a thing growing up where, like, my dad, it has a big head and I have a big head. And I actually did measure, the other day I measured my hat size. My girlfriend was graduating from grad school and she was sent a tape measure to measure her hat size. And I decided just to measure mine. And it was off the charts, Lewis. I mean, it was very close to the top of the range there. And so based on that, I think if my head was the size of a watermelon, it would be insane, but I already sort of have a big head. So maybe it would make more sense than all of a sudden I walk in and my head's the size of a tennis ball.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would go with the tennis ball because I think it would just be easier to go about your daily life. Now, either way, you're going to be a freak. So I would opt for the tennis ball.
That's not a fair term, Lewis. We don't like using that term because there are conditions that lead to people having big and small heads. Obviously not watermelon and tennis ball sized, but.
Yeah, but if it's the result of some weird hypothetical situation in which God gives you, I used God, right, gives you a watermelon-sized head, Dave, then it's a freakish situation. But yes, of course, there are medical conditions. Now, I don't really think there are any medical conditions that would leave you with a head the size of a tennis ball.
No.
But I would
not as an adult anyway.
Yeah, I would opt for the tennis ball because I think it would still be easier to go about your life, and you could still, manage things more easily and fit into spaces like normal and sleep in your bed like normal. So I think the watermelon-sized head would just make life too difficult.
I really am appreciating how seriously Lewis is taking this question. I mean, that was a very, very serious answer. From a practical perspective, how could I disagree with you? Obviously, I think life would be easier with a tennis ball-sized head than a watermelon-sized head. And certainly if you're all of a sudden finding yourself on an airplane, who's going to be more comfortable? I know I'm way more comfortable at 5'8" than I would be at 6'8" in height. And I assume I would be far more comfortable with a tennis ball-sized head than a watermelon-sized head. So, Alexis, I hope that answer is satisfactory to you. On the bonus show, NASA applauds a proposed 3D printed ice building for Mars, harvesting energy from ambient radio waves, and some teenagers die after being hypnotized by their principal at school. davidpakman.com/membership. Don't miss the bonus show. It's a whole other show for our members. Sign up today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.